in absolutely practical terms, dominance and war is dysfunctional. Whether one likes it or not, there is no other way of survival but peace.
When I was in the United States, I received a violent reaction from them. They didn't like my message for peace or against the nuclear war or war itself. But when I came to Canada, I found a very passive, almost indifferent world here. Maybe they felt they had nothing to do with the development of nuclear age.
The threat of nuclear war during the 1980s was real. It wasn't imagined. It was very real because the states, the United States, the Soviet Union, NATO, all of these defense systems were on high alert, were premised on the notion that when it becomes necessary, necessity defined by us, it's legitimate to use these weapon systems.
In the city of Hiroshima, the Peace Dome stands as a silent witness to the past. 50 years ago, thousands of people drowned here in the River Ota, plunging in to escape the first atomic fire. There are still witnesses to these events, survivors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Listening to them, we can learn what atomic warfare really means and remember how it all began. The atom bomb was born in the USA, but Canada played a major role in its development. Canadian scientists and Canadian raw materials were there from the beginning. What they helped to make took on a monstrous life of its own. From the ashes of Hiroshima, it went on to threaten the world. Every year on the 6th of August, there's a ceremony of remembrance in Hiroshima. Each lantern bears a name. Drifting out into the darkness, they carry the souls of those who died towards their final rest. A prayer goes with them. Rest in peace, for we will not repeat the evil. But the shadow still hangs over the human race.
This is Captain William Sterling Parsons of Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Captain Parsons made the original trip with the atomic bomb ship Enola Gay as weaponeer. Captain Parsons, will you tell us briefly the story of your trip from takeoff to target?
After a photographing session that made us feel like a Hollywood premiere, we got off at about 3 o'clock in the morning in the darkness and headed for Iwo Jima, which we reached about sunrise. We then headed for the Empire.
We got up early that morning because my father's hobby was fishing. So he got up early in the morning, he left home, he went out of the city, and he was at sea fishing at that time already. My mother was doing the dishes after breakfast. I walked over to the Hiroshima station. In front of the station, I met the rest of the girls in my group. We reached the building. We were on the second floor of this big wooden building.
bomb was finally released exactly at the designated hour, and the explosion occurred as planned. The sight that greeted our eyes was quite beyond what we had expected, because we saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
This is Captain Kermit K. Behan of Houston, Texas, bombardier of the great Artiste. Captain Behan, what was your most outstanding experience on this historic flight?
I suppose it was when the clouds opened up over the target at Nagasaki. The target was there pretty as a picture. I made the run, let the bomb go. That was my greatest thrill.
I saw the bluish-white flash outside the window, and that moment I had a sensation of floating in the air. That's the end of my consciousness.
Setsuko Nakamura was 13 years old when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
My own generation, my own age group was the hardest hit group, because from all the high schools in my city, 7,000 students were brought to the heart of the city. And they are the one without any protection from the explosion. They simply either vaporized, practically melted, died. And my sister-in-law was one of those. We never saw her again. By the time I came out, it was dark, like twilight. Then, as my eyes got adjusted to this, I began to see the streams and the streams of people slowly shuffling from the center of the city toward the hillside. They were burned, blackened skin peeling off. Some burnt bodies were already swelling, and some burnt hair were just standing upward. Some grotesque thing was some people's eye just popped out, hanging. And it was like ghost. It was really like a procession of ghosts. That huge military training ground was practically packed with the dead bodies and the dying people. And people were asking for water and water. And at night, we sat on the hill and looked down the entire city. There was one huge ball of fire just sweeping the whole city. But we just sat there in a stunned way. The night before, my elder sister, married sister with a 4-year-old child, came home because she wanted to see medical doctor. You see, she purposely made the effort to evacuate herself and her child. Her husband was away at war. In order to protect this only child, on the bridge, she and her 4-year-old son were burnt, and they survived several days, and they died in agony.
Thousands were dying of a disease doctors knew nothing about.
I was inside the building. Maybe I was protected from radiation. I did not suffer as other people. The only symptoms I had, was bleeding from the gum, bleeding, internal bleeding, loss of hair, and those things. After my sister and my nephew died, my parents went to my uncles and aunts' place to look after them. They suffered no burn, no injury at all. They looked normal. But obviously they were exposed to the radiation. They were very sick. They had to wear diapers. And according to my mother's description, their internal organs seemed to be rotten and melting and coming out in a black liquid form. But these are the only two people of thousands of people in the city who experienced the similar thing.
How did this happen? What pathways led here to this place, to this moment in history? The journey of death began with Nazi Germany's brutal drive to conquest. Seizing Europe and subjugating its people, Hitler's war machine showed it would stop at nothing to consolidate its power. The atom bomb was born out of fear of a great evil. Reports that this savage regime was working on a weapon that would unleash the power of the atom persuaded President Roosevelt, with Winston Churchill and Mackenzie King, that the Allies must build the bomb first. Combining the management skills of the American Army, the world's leading physicists, and Canadian industry and raw materials, Roosevelt created the Manhattan Project, the largest research and development project the world had ever known. With a staff of 200,000 and unlimited government funding, it was a journey into the unknown. In the end, developing the bomb took more of America's wealth than going to the moon. It began as a desperate race with Germany, but it became an end in itself. By 1945, the Manhattan Project was racing to finish the bomb before the war ended. On May 7th, 1945, 100 tons of dynamite were detonated to simulate the anticipated impact of a nuclear explosion. This was just a day before the Germans surrendered. With Germany defeated, many project scientists began to doubt whether the bomb should ever be used, but the majority agreed with the military decision to push on to the end. Two different bombs had been developed, Little Boy using uranium and Fat Man using plutonium. To test this bomb, the Army erected a 100-foot tower in New Mexico in the spring of 1945. On June the 3rd, the Japanese put out peace feelers to the Russians. On July the 12th, the plutonium core for the bomb was delivered to the test site. The same day, Japan's foreign minister radioed Moscow that the emperor wished to end the war. But the test continued as planned. At 5:30 a.m. on July the 16th, the world's first atomic bomb exploded in the New Mexico desert. William Lawrence wrote in the New York Times, "One felt as though he had been privileged to witness the birth of the world, to be present at the moment of creation, when the Lord said, "Let there be light." The search was over. The bomb was far more powerful than had been expected, but the mission was not yet complete. 2 days before the first atomic explosion, the uranium atom bomb left New Mexico for the island of Tinian. It contained all the uranium-235 produced so far, so the little boy design had not been tested. The drop over Hiroshima was planned as its trial run. By July 1945, the United States had destroyed the Japanese Navy and Air Force. Major cities had been leveled by conventional bombing raids, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been left intact. On July 28th, the Japanese asked the Soviet Union to mediate an end to the war. Many historians believe that Japan was on the verge of surrender, but after spending so much effort and money developing the atomic bomb, the U.S. military was determined to study its effectiveness in the theater of war.
Almost within a few weeks, the United States sent the teams of the specialists to start studying the effect of the radiation on human bodies. They built this research institute and started sending for those survivors to come and be examined, and how the survivors felt about that. It was bad enough to experience that, to be used as a guinea pig, and now to be examined. The citizens and survivors' reaction, immediate reaction after that experience was that we were used as a guinea pig. I didn't talk about that.
In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the living, the dying, and the dead became the raw material for a vast series of studies and experiments. Stacked here on these shelves are some of the 5,000 human body parts studied by the U.S. Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. Almost nothing was known about the effect of nuclear explosions on human beings, so the investigators recorded everything.
This is an example of a pattern of a dress burned onto the skin. This woman was 1 kilometer east of the epicenter. Although she was not burned, she received lacerations in the region of her left eye and ear. On September 6th, the eyeball had to be removed on account of abscess of vitreous. The prognosis was poor. In ovaries, the atrophy of primordial and Graft's follicles are observed. The spermatogenesis in the testicles has declined, and there are practically no spermatozoans left.
Few North Americans knew of these studies or saw these images of devastation and suffering. Their films urged them to relish the return of peace and to put their faith in their government's command of power.
It remained for air power and air power alone to finish the job. One day, August 5th, 1945, one B-29 left on a special mission. One airplane that represented the people of the United Nations and the millions who had lost their lives. One airplane that represented millions of man-hours of labor and billions of dollars of American money. That airplane carried the atomic bomb. Its destination was Hiroshima.
A city in ruins with one bomb.
Nagasaki destroyed a few days later with a second atomic bomb, so much more powerful that the first one was already obsolete.
On August 14th, 1945, the Pacific War was over.
Japan surrendered unconditionally, simply by pressure from a distance.
That pressure was air power, the strongest air power the world had ever known. It remains for the people of the United States to keep it that way.
In 1955, Setsuko Nakamura married Jim Thurlow and moved to Canada.
When I came to Canada, I found a very passive, almost indifferent world here. Maybe they felt they had nothing to do with the development of nuclear age, although Canada was involved in Manhattan Project, and the uranium came from Ontario to produce those bombs.
While this had been an international effort, Canadian scientists were closely involved in developing the atom bomb. Earlier in 1935, Arthur Dempster from Toronto had discovered uranium-235, the basic element of the atom bomb. Walter Zinn from Kitchener, Ontario, helped to create the first nuclear chain reaction with uranium-235 at Columbia University. Clarence Johnson from Minburn, Alberta, discovered how to purify uranium-235 at this top-secret plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Louis Slotin from Winnipeg, Manitoba, helped to determine how much uranium and plutonium was needed for an atomic explosion. He was part of the team that assembled the core of the first plutonium bomb in New Mexico in 1945. An important supplier of the Manhattan Project was located in Trail, BC, the Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company of Canada. It received millions of dollars to produce heavy water for the plutonium bomb. The atom bomb could not have been produced without Canada's uranium, first discovered near Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories. By the end of the 1930s, El Dorado Gold Mines was shipping out uranium by the barrel load to British and American physicists. On July 15, 1942, at the request of the U.S. and British governments, Prime Minister Mackenzie King passed a secret order in council taking control of El Dorado's uranium production. Next day, El Dorado signed a contract with the U.S. Army for 350 tons of uranium. A 500-ton order followed in December. A year later, El Dorado became a Crown corporation. Uranium was enriched for the atom bomb in Port Hope, Ontario, in El Dorado's refinery, the only one in North America. It refined all the uranium used by the Manhattan Project, Canada's own, as well as 2,000 tons imported from the then Belgian Congo. In this way, the Canadian government supplied the essential elements that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was our bomb, too.
But the Canadians were not informed about those things. They really felt that was the trouble between the United States and Japan, without recognizing this was a universal phenomena, the global phenomena we all have to be concerned about.
After the war, the United States couldn't keep its nuclear monopoly for long. In August 1949, U.S. planes detected radiation in the atmosphere. Russia had exploded its first atom bomb. Now there were no limits to its power in Eastern Europe. This was the United States response, the hydrogen bomb, developed in 1951 and tested on islands in the South Pacific over the next few years. The first hydrogen bomb was more than 500 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. Tested in 1952, it vaporized the island of Alugalab, leaving a crater 2 miles wide. A bomb twice as powerful again was tested in 1954 on Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. Ignoring advice from its own Navy, the US government decided not to evacuate the islands in the area. On the island of Rongala, people suffering from radioactive poisoning were examined by the US military, but received no treatment. The Russians responded with nuclear tests of their own, 500 of them from 1949 on at their test range in Kazakhstan. Like the Americans, they studied the effects on buildings, animals, and people. One Kazakh villager remembers.
When I heard in 1949 that the first nuclear test explosion was to be conducted in this country, I was truly pleased. I thought that with this, we would no longer be beaten by the US. I was really proud of the Soviet Union. But now, I realize that some 70% of the villagers have died of cancer. I used to live in a village called Maiskaya. People died one after another, without being given any medical treatment.
The legacy of Hiroshima continues. Fleeing the Russian blockade of Berlin, Ursula Franklin came to Canada in 1949. A physicist at the University of Toronto, she spent 40 years fighting for peace.
I think one must remember that in the First World War there was poison gas, which already was an inkling of the misuse of science and out of the arbitrariness of who is a victim and who is not. Now, the nuclear weapons were an escalation of that. There was no more battlefield, there was no more soldiers, there were no more friends or foes. You could be in the Arctic and feel the effect as much as you could feel it in Japan. And that something had entered that was quite different in kind and had to influence the politics both of war and the threat of war, that there were tools in the hands of people, in the hands of men, that could not be used.
But they were used. Since then, the possibility of using them again has shaped international relationships. Professor Ernie Regehr is the co-founder of the Canadian Peace Research Organization, Project Ploughshares.
See, Canada's role during the Cold War was as a partner and participant with the United States. And the United States was specifically committed to developing the capacity to not only deter nuclear war, but to actually fight a nuclear war and to prevail at the end of that nuclear war. One of the fundamental requirements for an American capacity to fight a nuclear war during the Cold War and survive in some manner of speaking was to prevent to prevent a Soviet second strike capability. Well, one of the essential elements of that was to prevent the Soviet manned piloted bombers from coming across Canadian territory and striking at North American cities after the Soviet Union had suffered an attack. And that required the capacity to detect those bombers on Canadian territory and to launch attacks on them while they were still in Canadian territory.
Canada decided not to develop its own atomic bomb, but opened its borders to the U.S. nuclear arsenal. The Canadian government minimized the danger of becoming a battlefield, accepting instead the American vision of a winnable nuclear war and promoting it in government-sponsored films. This film suggests Canadian cities could survive a nuclear attack. It acknowledges the destructive power of atom and hydrogen bombs, but its message is reassuring. With proper planning, families could be reunited in the suburbs and given food and clothing. Canadian cities could take care of the surviving homeless ones.
This is a message of extreme urgency from the Government of Canada. There is a danger of enemy attack on North America. Every householder is advised to begin immediately the construction of an emergency shelter. The house walls are not dense enough to provide much shielding, so move all available furniture against those walls that surround your shelter.
Many people feel that protection against the effects of a nuclear explosion is not possible. This is not true. Protection is possible, and those who follow the 11 steps to survival will greatly increase their chances of surviving. Get a copy and read it. Know how to prevent and fight fires. This is the time to put out small fires before they become big ones.
The reality of nuclear war is very different.
Well, 2 days later, my father and I and another sister who came to join us wandered around the city trying to find my sister-in-law who never came back. We have to step over the dead bodies, or we have to turn the faces of those dead bodies to identify my sister-in-law. And also we went back where our house had stood, trying to find something, but we really couldn't find anything. We did see the pile of teacups and rice balls and all these things piled up together and melted together. Perhaps we should have saved them, but we didn't. But there is one thing I still cherish. That is Western style ornamental clock. It was burnt, but it came out. That's the only thing I have. We found out from the rubble. So to me, that little piece of burnt clock, it's something which connects me with the past. So for that reason, it's very important. I treasure it.
Many Canadians understood that a nuclear war would destroy everything they valued in life, and they rejected it.
I think it's just rotten to have the crews tested in Canada, so I just came out here and tried to do my best.
Thousands of protesters attended peace rallies like this one at the University of Toronto in 1982. Setsuko Thurlow reminded her audience how the weapon used in Hiroshima had come to tyrannize the world.
Peoples around the world, with their deafening silence, have permitted their governments
to continue producing and accumulating ever more destructive weapons of genocide. Even when they are not used, they cause us to live in fear. They're controlled by the small number of people, hold us hostage, and robs us of the freedom to control our own destinies. And testing of the nuclear weapons has been killing people in the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. And over $500 billion being spent on armaments this year diverts the resources that could feed the starving, heal the sick, and teach the illiterate.
The peace movement had little support on Parliament Hill. Warren Almond had been speaking out for 25 years about the dangers of nuclear war. Few other members of Parliament were listening.
Order 21, the member Notre Dame de Grace, Lachine East.
Mr. Speaker, in 1989, the last year for which we have figures, the countries of the world spent over $1 trillion on arms of all kinds. And the nuclear weapon states have accumulated approximately 60,000 nuclear weapons. Mr. Speaker, those 60,000 nuclear weapons have 1 million times more power than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Those 60,000 nuclear weapons represent 4 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. 4 tons of TNT for every individual on the face of the earth. And those bombs, those nuclear bombs, are capable of destroying 800 million people in 12 hours.
Today, the law is being enlisted in the battle. Soldiers ordered to march towards explosions, communities contaminated by radiation. In courts around the world, people are challenging governments that expose their citizens to fallout. Peace activists are turning to the United Nations World Court. Henrietta Landgren from the Physicians for Global Survival.
And we've been one of 8 Canadian organizations. We've been working with the Canadian Peace Alliance, United Church of Canada, Project Ploughshares, Lawyers for Social Responsibility, Veterans Against Nuclear Arms, Science for Peace, I think that's all of them. And we've been working to get a ruling from the International Court of Justice, or the World Court in The Hague, on the legality of nuclear weapons. So we've been collecting something called a declaration of conscience from citizens. These will be taken into account when the judges meet in the court to discuss the legality of nuclear weapons.
The question is very simple, and it's for all of us to answer. Does anyone have the right to do this to another human being? If the answer is no, then what can we do to unmake the weapons that have caused such lasting harm? When we remember the truth of what happened 50 years ago and acknowledge our part in it, we have a chance to end the nuclear threat. Then these souls can rest in peace, for we will not repeat the evil.
In this post-Cold War environment, it ought to be a moral imperative for us to say that we will be a nuclear weapon-free zone, that we make that declaration and then we follow the policies that are needed in order to make that real. We need to find a way of saying unequivocally that nuclear weapons are an unmitigated evil. They have no place in the security systems of humanity, and we need to distance ourselves from that.
War and the preparation for war is destruction for all. One has to make peace among people. One has to make peace with the earth. And whether It's in time. It's an open question, but certainly there are no alternatives to peace.
Although the Cold War has ended, very little progress has been made as far as dismantling the nuclear weapon stockpiles. I think Canada, as one of the nations which doesn't own the nuclear weapon, I think can perhaps more loudly, more strongly be advocating for the general and comprehensive nuclear disarmament.